All of you, very, very warm welcome. I'm Jack Broderick, president of the Kent Island Heritage Society, and I see so many friends, neighbors, and heritage supporters here tonight. And on behalf of our board, again, very, very warm welcome. We have a really special treat here this evening, a unique place and a really unique and important story to tell. And we are honored that this story has been considered so important that it's recognized by the National Park Service with the role that it played in the Underground Railroad. So it's a unique story, it's an important part of our heritage, and I think you'll find not only do we have some really neat, very old places here on the island that you hear about, but unique stories that give us insight to what a very different kind of life was like here on a very different island, a little more than a century and a half ago. So I'm going to introduce now one of our board members, Mr. John Conley, who will introduce our very special speakers. John is a man of many hats on our board. He's on our executive board. He's a man of many talents. He's our recording secretary, our newsletter editor, our outreach membership coordinator, and puts together programs like this. So I can't thank John enough for everything he's done for our Heritage Society and for all of you. John Conley.
Thank you. Thanks, Jack, for reading that the way I wrote it. First of all, the most important announcement, the restrooms are through this door. You go through the parish hall there. There's a handicap at the very far rear of the hall and the other there. So, and then the second thing I would be remiss not to do is to thank Nancy Cook and the Friend of Historic Christ Church for letting us hold this event here. And this hall is now up and running, available for weddings and different kinds of events. And I better mention that. I'm going to kind of skip through some of the stuff I had to write down for my spontaneous remarks. I've been here since 2013, so definitely a chicken necker. But I've been so impressed by how much effort has gone into preserving the history of Kent Island, its buildings, its people, and the stories. And that's kind of what we're going to do tonight. It's a special building to me because I live up Gibson's grant, so that's on the property that Andrew will be talking about. And then we're going to talk about, as we're covering the entire history of the property, some events that happened in the 1850s and 60s, that we have a gentleman who's going to speak to about some of the people who were enslaved there. I'm going to kind of go to the speakers, and Andrew Costello, he and his wife Mackenzie moved a few years ago to Gibson's grant, and for those of us that are economically shares from Gibson's grant, when we went there to look at the property and houses, the real estate office was actually in the Manor house. And so a lot of us started saying, okay, I wonder what's going to happen to it, I wonder what's going to happen to it. Well, this young man and his wife came in and immediately extended welcome to us in the community to come and see it and watch them develop it. And Andrew, I'm not going to read all this for Andrew, but when he's not studying the history of where he lives, his part-time job is managing director at Centra, where he's the head of the telecommunications network business for North America. So in his spare time, that's what he does. I'm excited, we're all excited that a new generation came to the Manor in June of last year. He and his wife had their first child, so that's fun to see them out walking around with. He's a graduate of William & Mary and specialized in a number of things, but with a real interest even in college in colonial history. Our second gentleman, Matthew LaRoche, is a graduate student at the University of Maryland. For a young guy like this, he's done an awful lot with the National Park Service. He did an awful lot of research at Gettysburg. He's currently one thesis away from his master's degree at the University of Maryland. He's already working in different PhD programs, so when he comes back again in the future, we'll have to call him a doctor. But anyway, he's been a delight and somebody old like me to see two young people like this who really want to study history, you know, that's very gratifying. So I'm going to shut up, get out of the way, and turn it over to the experts. Andrew?
So if John's a chicken necker, I don't know what that makes my wife and myself. We just moved here, gosh, probably about 5 years ago. Actually, ironically, we moved and got married in the same month, and so it was quite an adventure on the tail ends of doing a light restoration on the property. And so couldn't be happier. Lived in DC for about a decade before that, and certainly loved the area on Kent Island and Queens County. So just a little bit of background here. We're going to be talking, as John mentioned, about Stoopley Gibson. It's gone by a number of names over the years. White's Heritage, when the White family inhabited. We'll kind of walk through the progression and the history there. But I want to start with just a little bit of a map here. This is actually the first map that we found that actually shows the original property. This is from 1670. If you're not familiar with Augustine Herman, he was commissioned to come out and create a map of the full Chesapeake Bay. Actually, I have a full print of it here. Later on, he settled on a property called Bohemia, which is up in Kent County, and you know, spent the rest of his days up there. He was sort of famous for creating one of the first really sort of detailed maps of the Chesapeake Bay. And you can see actually that at least where the house is today, there's some indication that there was something there. You know, with the resolution, we don't really know what it was, but we know that the land's been inhabited for a really long time. And there's still a house there today. This is all where we live now, part of the Gibson's Grant community, which was sort of part of the original farm. We'll talk a little bit about that as well. But I want to start with a timeline, because I feel like sometimes it's easier to sort of ground ourselves and baseline ourselves in sort of the chronology of how we got from where we were to where we are today. And I'm going to apologize. If you can't hear me in the back of the room, just like wave or something and let me know. I know it's a big space, so I'm going to try to speak loudly. So yeah, as we're talking about the timeline here, as we go back, and if you've done things with the Heritage Society before, you've probably heard a lot of discussion around Claiborne and his group of men and women who settled kind of Kent Island initially down in Fort Kent on the southern end of Route 8. You know, over time moved up to Broad Creek, where we had a community for a very long time. You know, the predecessor to this church, right? The cemetery is still there over in Broad Creek. If you haven't had a chance to check it out, I do highly recommend it. And you're kind of seeing all of that happen sort of in the early 1600s, right? 1630 to 1650. You know, really you're talking about 150 or so settlers, for lack of better terms, right? The second permanent, third permanent settlement in the colonies, right? So these families moved up from, many of them from Jamestown, to kind of settle this new outpost, kind of in this new America that was being explored. And that kind of sets the stage for right where we're going to start talking, right? The initial land grant for Stoopley Gibson was in 1856, or sorry, 1656. And we'll sort of start the time there. We'll talk through a little bit. What we've done, or what I've done in a lot of the presentations, sort of segmented it. I know it's a little harder for the time projector, so apologies, but into some of these periods, right? We have kind of the pre-colonial period, sort of what happened during the colonies. We'll talk about the Brights, who owned the home from the property from 1730 until right after the Civil War. We'll talk about the White family, who owned a kind of reconstruction all the way through to the early 20th century, and then everything that's happened kind of since then. But like the rest of the world, I feel like there's like 800 things that happened in the last 100 years or so. But we'll kind of touch base on some of that as well. And it kind of ended with Gibson's Grant development today. And so the story starts with two gentlemen, Henry and John. That's what we're going to talk about. Henry's student, John Gibson. And they were two partners and mates. At least that's what was referred or referenced in the their initial plots of the property. But they came out and created this farm. They were part of that original settlement with Claiborne, and they sort of created this small initial community. They were very well known from what we can tell in the historical record. But they went out and sort of plotted the land in 1656. and had the first plat sort of registered. It's interesting to me, if you look at the plat here and the record, there's names that you'll hear kind of commonly, throughout the area, right? Thomas Ringgold, John Winchester. Some of those families are still here today, as are the Gibsons as well. So yeah, it's just kind of was the initial history and sort of founding of the property. I thought it was interesting to highlight as well that the property where Gibson's Grant is today isn't the same now as it was 250 years ago, so more than 300 years ago. We've seen a lot of shoreline erosion, as much of Kent Island. We've had other lectures as well, and I'm sure we'll in the future too, talking about some of the geography and the geology of where we are, but we're kind of in the perfect location for shoreline erosion. You can actually see the white line here. I mean, this only goes back to the 1840s, right? So when you're talking 1600s, it was probably even further out. But just as time has gone by, it's eroded the land as well. So you can see how it's kind of receded sort of ever since. So as I mentioned, John Gibson and Henry Stoop in 1656 patented the land for 150 acres. Between 1656 and 1730, that 70-year period was pretty volatile for the time. I mean, especially considering it's a community of 100, 150 or so people. So you can see here, John and Henry owned it, and then a year later, it transferred to John and Elizabeth, who was likely married to Henry at that point in time. Maybe he had passed away. It's all sort of unknown, but it passed into them. It ultimately then landed in the hands of Andrew and Eleanor in 1658. So you're talking about 4 years after it was, maybe not 2 years after it was planted. Andrew ended up with it. The only thing we know about Andrew is he's called the Spaniard. So it's an interesting anecdote. For a largely British population to have somebody from Spain, that was kind of how they were being identified. But Andrew Eleanor owned the property in 1658. And at that point, it's condensed a little bit to 125 acres. Andrew passed away, and as happened in the colonies at the time, or in the pre-colony at the time, people lived short lives. And so the property then passed shortly thereafter in 1660, 2 years later again, to his wife, Anarchy. And what's interesting is Anarchy then remarried 4 or 5 times, likely to the deaths of her husbands. Yeah. But for tracing the history, it makes it really complex. You can see we've got like 8 different names mentioned here. And largely that's because she kept remarrying. And so when she ultimately passed away, there was a bit of a kerfluffle around who should end up with the property, right? She had multiple husbands, different kids, cousins. The Kent Island community at that point was very small, and so people were all related in some capacity, right? Or at least were very familiar with one another in such a small, tight-knit community. It ended up passing to the husbands of her 2 daughters. And so William Joyner and Lawrence Arnold then took ownership of the property in 1674 after a court basically ruled on the proper ownership for who the property would transfer to. And that's the last sort of record we have of what happened with the property in this period. We don't know, did it stay in their families? Did they sell it to somebody else? Was it left to go fallow? It's a bit unclear. What we do know about Kent Island at that point in time is it was going through some pretty rapid expansion, right? It was emerging from kind of that William Claiborne kind of initial settlement, and people were expanding to find more and more land. So if anybody's interested, like the history of Kent County was really fascinating. Kent County was founded by, modern Kent County was founded by settlers from Kent Island. And so people started moving up the Chesapeake. They went across the Eastern Neck, they worked their way up, and eventually created Chestertown, right? And so you're thinking about the ships moving up and down the rivers, up and down the bay in this period. It's very possible that the property was sort of abandoned, right? Because at 150-ish, 125 acres, it's not a huge farm by scale. It's possible, at least my opinion, that people may have been going out looking for larger fields and more space, and so they were leaving Kent Island, and as a result, the property sort of just kind of remained for the next 50 years or so. But we do know something happened. So as part of the development of Gibson Grant, the developer completed 2 separate archaeological research studies of the property, both phase 1 and phase 2 investigation. And during the phase 2 investigation, they actually found what was likely the original residence on the property. For those of you who have seen Cray House across the street, it was probably more similar to that, right? You're talking about very, very early colonial homes. It was at best a brick foundation with a wood structure, probably originally a 1-room home that was expanded to 2. Whoever was on the property at that point probably used that as their residence. But they did find a brick foundation for a small building that wasn't on any of the maps or any of the history. So the findings from the archaeological studies was that it was probably the original home on the property. So that was done kind of in the early to mid 2000s, that archaeological research. And so the McKinney Court settlement was sort of that original property. You can see here sort of a photo of what that foundation looked like. Again, brick in this time period would have been pretty rare and pretty special. So it isn't just it likely wasn't a barn or a shed, but something more significant at that point in time. All of this takes us up to 1730. So the next kind of data point we have on the history of the Stoopley and Gibson property, named for Stoopley and Gibson, that I mentioned that earlier, is in 1730, when Francis Bright, a settler from England, had the property researched. And so we know at that point in time, he went out to the county government in Queenstown at the time and had them sort of reissue the plat for the property and sort of took ownership. So it's likely that it had been abandoned at that point. There was no way to lay claim to it. And so he was able to go out and sort of have that grab for himself in 1730. So that's kind of the next data point. That's sort of the story now as we moved into the Bright period, as I was talking about earlier, these large areas of the home and the property. And the Brights, were quite prolific. So in 1776, you're seeing Francis Sr., his wife, 3 kids, and 7 enslaved people. So a total of 12 people were living on the property. By 1790, there was 23. So the property is basically doubled over this time period. And I think Matt will talk a little bit more about what that really means, I think, as we get into the next chapter of the discussion here. In terms of the house, we showed the picture earlier. We don't really know when it was built. What we know is that it first appeared on the tax records in 1790. We know it's at least that old. There's some indications based on the architecture of the property, of the house, that it's probably in the 1760 to 1780 period. So you're really talking right at that Revolutionary War time period when the home was built, which would sort of make sense for the structure of the town. And so, as I mentioned before, there was a lot of change going on kind of in this time period in this place, right? You may have heard references to the Eastern Shore being the breadbasket of the Revolution. If you haven't had a chance to check out Old Wide Mill down in my mill, certainly a lot of history for what this area was to our new country kind of in the time period. So again, you're going from 1730 right up in the middle of the war, largely the Loyalist area, the Revolutionary War, some support for the war efforts, and kind of the period shortly thereafter. And as the Brights owned the property from 1730 until 1868, as I mentioned, right through this sort of Civil War period, they saw a lot of progress, right? Not only the Revolutionary War, but the War of 1812. I don't know how many people are familiar, but Kent Island was actually occupied during the War of 1812 by the British. So it served as their outpost and sort of the base of their campaigns. If you've heard about the ships that have sailed on St. Michael's or Rock Hall or even up to Washington, that fleet was based here. They occupied several of the homes. The soldiers were quartered out in the fields. Certainly they replenished their stocks and food during that period as well. So just a tremendous amount of history, just even more than 12. And then here, the founding of Stevensville, right? Stevensville was a little bit later in the timeline because, as I mentioned before, the original sort of community, right, over on Broad Creek, silted in, right? The harbor wasn't as deep, and so the whole history of why the community kind of moved up here and started the town of Stevensville. Moved the church that we're in here right now from its original location up here to this new town. All of that kind of happening in the mid-19th century as the area kind of continued to evolve and grow. I don't want to call it the downfall, but the departure of the Brights is kind of an interesting story as well. So we'll be talking a little bit about Francis Bright Jr., who lived kind of in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And so he had a son, James Bright, who lived on the property. And James had multiple children, as people did at the time, many children. And his eldest son, James Bright Jr., probably came of age before James Bright Sr. was really ready to hand off the property, right? Probably still had young children. As people do today, he went off to make his own fortunes. And so he actually resettled in another area of the island, where Marlon Spirit Farm was, down, but he settled down there and started a family, and actually had multiple generations of Brights who lived down near Parsons Point. And the property actually went to his second son, Franklin. And Franklin sort of tells an interesting story. Franklin ended up dying interstate without a will, and married older in life and married an older woman, likely to bring some money to the family, but ultimately didn't have any heirs himself. And so the property went into foreclosure, I guess, right? Sort of the colonial equivalent thereof. And so they opted, since the family had sort of expanded to other places on the island, they had opted to move in a different direction. They sold the house to the White family, Marmaduke White. And the thing to keep in mind, again, it's still a small community, not 100 people anymore, but still very well known. And so, of course, the Whites and the Brights were related, right? They were cousins, second cousins. And so, maybe it might have been perceived at the time almost as a transfer within the family, even though it was going from sort of one last name to another. And there was definitely relationships between the two families. And so, in 1868, the house sort of moved over to the Whites, and we'll touch on that a little bit more later in the discussion. But I thought this was sort of a telling map. This is a map here from 1866, the Judy Strong map. There's a copy of a newer version of it actually hanging out there. But you can see the references to Franklin Bright here, his ownership of the property. James Bright at this point had moved down here, and then there was another one of the children who came down Route 8 as well. So they had expanded pretty extensively. These maps are really cool because you get to kind of go in and see all the different names of the different people who lived here at the different times. And there's copies of it online as well. People are curious and interested. You can certainly read about some of the other family members and the other families that were quite prominent here on the island at the time. And so with that, I'll hand you off to Matt, and we can talk a little bit about Massey.
Well, I'd like to thank Andrew for that wonderful overview of Stoopley Gibson as a site. I would like to pivot now and talk a little bit about a particular resident of Stoopley Gibson, Henry Massey, who was an enslaved man who escaped from the island in October of 1849. And before I jump into that, my hope here is to get a little bit of a look under the hood of how this sort of historical research is done. And so I want to quickly talk a little bit about sources, which Andrew and I both love sources. And I was very grateful to get that strong map on there because I wasn't able to fit it into my PowerPoint, and it is beautiful. The first thing I want to talk about is verification versus plausibility. And that's particularly relevant when we're talking about doing African American history, particularly the history of slavery. Put simply, today if I was to go and re-up my driver's license, I walk into the MDA and I've got 3 different forms of identification. I might have my birth certificate with me. That simply doesn't apply if we're talking about the period that I study. The nature of the records of slavery is incredibly fragmentary, often full of silences. And the reason for that is that what did survive of enslaved life survived largely because it had utility to others. It has very rarely anything to do with the enslaved person themselves. And so when you're doing this work and when a historian accounts for those biases that are built in, the differences in perspective, and tries to read sort of against the grain, put different documents that wouldn't seemingly go together in conversation with each other, even doing that, some things can never be perfectly known. And I would argue that's okay. It's best to have half of the conversation than no conversation at all. And to give you a little sense of what I'm talking about, I want to talk about how I met Henry Massey, so to speak. The beginning of Henry Massey's story in the historical record is tied to James Bright's 1845 will. This is the very first time that his name appears written anywhere. And it describes James's desire that when the time comes and when he passes and the estate is divided up, Henry Massey should go to his son Joseph. And this is the end, supposedly, of Henry Massey's story. The last time he appears written in the historical narrative until we got to talking. This is Samuel May's The Fugitive Slave Law and Its Victims. This is essentially sort of a manifesto, an abolitionist manifesto against the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. And this is how I met Henry Massey. It's just this 2-line description, just saying that he had been an enslaved man from Maryland, captured in Harrisburg and brought before a commissioner before being sentenced and returned. Obviously, there's not a lot there. It doesn't tell you anything about Henry Massey as a man. It doesn't talk about his family or his accomplishments or dreams. And I think this raises a really essential question for this kind of work, which is how do you resurrect somebody's story when the story was never meant to survive? And so, having set the stage with that, I want to talk about resurrecting Henry Massey a little bit. From comparing different census records, it appears that he was born about 1835. We don't know certainly if he was born on the property or not. But we do know he was owned by, again, James Bright, who, thanks to Andrew, we've got a little sense of. There's a long history, as Andrew alluded to, of enslaved life on the property and on Kent Island more generally. I know you already mentioned the 1776 census, where the family is listed as owning 7 enslaved people. By the 1845 will, that number has ballooned to 28 enslaved people. And it's curious because if you look at the previous year's census, 1840 census, James Bright only has about 8 to 11 people, depending on which James is listed where. Meaning that over half of all the enslaved people on the property that Henry Massey would have lived with, would have known with, would have been family to, were born or bought in the last handful of years, the last 5 years. I think this adds an interesting question to the story. So why is James Bright investing so heavily in slavery at that time? And it's kind of a curious question because the nature of slavery in Maryland was a peculiar one, particularly by the time that Henry Massey enters the scene. By this point, Maryland is actually a net export of enslaved people. In a way, people are divesting from slavery at home in Maryland and investing, allowing other people to invest in slavery in the Deep South and in the lands expanding westward. Curiously, Maryland and Baltimore in particular has the largest free black population in the country at the time. And as a result, the kind of labor that enslaved people were doing in Maryland is a bit different from our typical mental image. Largely, in many cases, skilled laborers, often loaned out to various cottage industries. That's not exactly possible on Kent Island, with the exception of perhaps fishing. The options are far more limited. James Bright is thus largely, he's likely investing in slavery as a way of growing more food crops, as Andrew had alluded to, being the breadbasket. And he's investing in his own estate. And it's curious from the perspective of the enslaved people here at Stoopley Gibson. There's so little that survives of what their experience would have been, and I had a hard time trying to sort of, as best as possible, recreate what would have life been like for them. And weirdly enough, the breakthrough clue came in census records of all things, which are not usually the most exciting records, but it comes from this issue of names, and then will, of course. When you're talking about census records in the era of slavery, there's no accounting for enslaved people except as numbers. Names are not recorded. In the will that James Bright writes, it does list kind of haphazardly certain surnames, so you can start to tell what family groups are present on the property. Henry Massey, like I pointed out earlier, is indeed named. There's also a Mary Massey, who, by backtracking from census records after emancipation, is about a year younger than him, so is likely his sister. There's also a pair who, by comparing some later census records and also by seeing what names Henry and Mary are giving to their children, giving to the next generation, it appears that the pair was, if not a father, then at least a father figure to them. And so this brings us up to the escape. He escapes in October of 1849, and the trigger for this is the breaking up of the Bright family estate. James Bright actually dies a few years before this happened, but his wife continues to live on the property, and so there's a bit of a freeze put on dividing up the estate until she passes in 1849, and then suddenly everything's going. The estate's cannibalized and given to all the children and the siblings and the grandchildren. And as I mentioned earlier, Henry Massey is going to a Joseph Bright. And by going and digging a little bit more into Joseph Bright's, what we know of Joseph Bright's history, and specifically by looking at his will, and comparing that to James's will, it kind of, you begin to get a picture of him as sort of a black sheep of the family. He's quite literally a trust fund baby. So while Franklin is given the estate, Joseph is given a small fund of about $1,000 that's time released, it's getting paid out first after 2 years and the rest of it after another 2 years. And so that alone wasn't enough to sort of argue that the man has money issues, but looking at his 1853 will, it became pretty clear that when he did pass, he died with a fair amount of debt and not many assets. And so I think it's possible to argue that if the family knew that he was perhaps bad with money, and if the registrar of wills knows that he's not so great with money, you can be pretty sure that the enslaved people on the plantation know that he's not very good with money. And this changes the calculus of escape for somebody like Henry Massey. Under a normal breaking up of families, the conversation might be, my family members might be relocated to another part of the island, or they might be relocated to another part of the county. But going to the man that is most likely to go into debt and to have to liquidate you as an asset and sell you south changes things. And so at that point, I would suspect that Henry Massey decided that even though he's a young man, he's only about 14 at this point, escape is the better of the two options. Now, we can't really recreate, at least not at the current moment, what escape route he would have taken. And it's also unclear once he reached his first freedom what he was doing for those 5 years in Harrisburg. I've looked at the census records for Harrisburg, and I am pretty confident he was not going by Henry Massey, which would have been a smart move. And so, having said that, the 5 years that Henry Massey is spending in Harrisburg are very active years in the rest of the state and in the country as a whole. Most notably the passage of the Compromise of 1850. Now, for anybody that doesn't necessarily remember high school history, you're okay, I understand. The main thing to understand about the Compromise of 1850 is it is another attempt at keeping the sectional balance of power between free and slave states intact. The Fugitive Slave Act is just one part of a tranche of different elements to this compromise. But I think it's important to kind of understand what the bill said and how terrible of a bill it really was. I think the best way to think about the court system that Henry Massey would face when he went to Philadelphia, when he's taken to Philadelphia, is to kind of think about like the modern immigration court system, in that it's a federally established court system, very top-down, and it's concerned with targeting one specific group of people to establish status or identity and to control movement. The circuit courts were allowed to appoint U.S. commissioners, judges in all that name. And one of the most electrifying and damaging parts of this bill to that sectional compromise I mentioned is the fact that it nullified free state personal liberty or anti-kidnapping laws. So ever since previous Supreme Court cases, most notably Prick versus Pennsylvania in the 1840s, the way that the Fugitive Slave Clause of the Constitution was interpreted was that the federal government was responsible for enforcement, right? Meaning that if you are in a free state, if you're a citizen or a law enforcement officer in a free state, you have no obligation to help take somebody back to slavery. And this bill kind of threw that back in everybody's face. So suddenly you can be compelled. And you can be compelled with fines and jail time. It doesn't matter if you're a marshal or a sheriff or just a civilian. You're eligible to be punished if you refuse to help enforce this law. And talk about in the courtroom procedurally, one of the worst parts of this bill is this issue of summary judgment, right? There is no jury. It is this one judge that decides your fate, and the emphasis is on speed, not accuracy. The defendant also is not given a right to testify. And there are some really very blatant pro-slavery financial incentives to how the bill is written, namely that the commissioner and the arresting officer, usually a marshal or a deputy marshal, are paid $10 for returning a person to slavery and $5 if they let them go free. So along with creating a massive uproar because of how blatant all this is, it also, the bill as a whole has sort of a questionable element of constitutionality. It is later upheld in 1859, but it is kind of interesting that it takes a decade to actually have a proper hearing on the bill itself. Things are heating up in Pennsylvania as well. I think to sort of understand the context that Henry Massey was being dragged into when he's taken to Philadelphia forcibly, I will start with the man on the bottom, actually, the image on the bottom. That's Governor William F. Johnson, Whig of Pennsylvania. And in 1850, as the debate over the compromise and over the Fugitive Slave Act, before it's actually passed into law, is really heating up. He is, and the state of Pennsylvania are specifically targeted and called to the carpet by Virginia and by Georgia for violating the constitutional compact, right? You're not enforcing the Fugitive Slave Clause. Why aren't you? And when he responds back, he's trying to maintain that sectional balance and peace as a politician. But he's also expressing a lot of displeasure over the act and over slavery as a whole, which boils down to essentially saying, this is not quite verbatim, but close enough. If we were voting to establish slavery today, I and Pennsylvania would be against it in a heartbeat, but as it is the law of the land, I'm bound to enforce it. And at the same time, he's also hearkening back to a very proud Pennsylvanian legacy of resisting slavery, going back to when they abolished slavery just after the American Revolution. And of course, this is also undergirded by a large Quaker population that at this time is still kind of carrying that banner forward. And that's how we get to this wonderful woman in the middle, Lucretia Mott, a member of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. This is a much older society than the Anti-Slavery Society, which we'll get to in a moment. The main thing to understand about it is that the leadership of this society was heavily saturated with Quakers who were very uncomfortable with the idea of violence, even rather uncomfortable with civil disobedience in many cases. And so in terms of what action that society was really willing to take, it was pretty limited to sort of stoking an outrage machine through the press, targeting people for supporting the Fugitive Slave Act, particularly Commissioner Ingram, and also providing a pretty robust legal defense network. So when enslaved or people that were accused of being fugitive slaves were brought before the court, they could expect basically pro bono representation. At the same time, again, various people were not quite satisfied with that level of engagement, including Lucretia Mott at one point, who, along with William Still, who's the man at the top, helps to develop the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society. And part of that process is them getting getting their hands a little bit dirtier, so to speak. So William Still is, of course, most famously known as being perhaps the best documented Underground Railroad conductor, and actually the linchpin of escaping through Philadelphia. And so this represents sort of a new dimension to the question of how is Philadelphia going to resist the Fugitive Slave Act. It kind of boils down to a debate about whether to be a radical or a practical. right? At the time, there were quite a lot of basically what we would call op-eds today, opining that abolitionists were too radical. They were perhaps, we might say, virtue signaling. They're concerned with their own image, their own sense of moral justice, and it made them myopic. Versus the practicals, say, like Governor Johnson, who are willing to sort of take the issue of slavery in America as a whole, and we're concerned first and foremost with preserving union and preserving peace. In any case, for Henry Massey, things took quite a curve when he's arrested along the Harrisburg Canal on Saturday, September 23rd, 1854. So what I would call his first freedom comes to a pretty abrupt end. It's interesting that his case has quite a lot of parallels. This is quite possibly the very last case that Commissioner Ingram hears in Philadelphia before dying in November 1854. So there's an interesting parallel to the very first case that Commissioner Ingram hears, which is the Adam Gibson case, which happened around December of 1850. For a first case, a first hearing of this act in Philadelphia, it's quite a farce. And I wish I had all the time to go on and on about this. I think it's one of the most fascinating parts of this whole topic. And the newspapers did too. The New York Tribune published pretty much the entirety of the cross-examination because it was so abominable. But the main thing to know is that Gibson was a free man from New Jersey. He was not an enslaved man. He's accused of stealing chickens after he decides to come over to Philadelphia on a Saturday and go to a market. And the men who accost him and bundle him into a carriage, one of them, George F. Alberti, is quite literally a convicted kidnapper under Pennsylvania state law. When he's taken and eventually gets his representation and is assured that there's no case here, you can go, Gibson, as a free man, kind of evinces this desire to clear his name, right? Whatever his citizenship status, however tenuous it is, he feels like it's something he has to protect and he has to defend publicly. So he requests to be taken to court, again, thinking that the charge is stealing chickens. When he arrives at Commissioner Ingram's court, he's accused of being an Emory Rice of Maryland, former slave to a William Knight of Cecil County. Obviously, that must have been quite a shock for him. It's interesting as well that at this moment, you have the beginning of an old showdown that will repeat itself time and time again in Philadelphia over the coming years, as one of Gibson's lawyers is David Paul Brown, who is absolutely a legal superstar of his era. He's a paid orator who travels the country. I mean, I think you might call him something like Johnny Cochran of his time, perhaps. Wonderful defense attorney. He's going up and combating the Ingram court for the very first time. He'll later repeat this as Henry Massey's lawyer 4 years later. One of the first things that comes up is, again, this question of summary judgment. How quick can we make this? And for Ingram, the answer is quite quick. He wants to rush the Gibson case through and get it out the door. Again, I wish I could go into all the fascinating twists and turns of this particular trial, but I'll suffice it to say that at the end of the deliberations, the prosecutor is begging Commissioner Ingram that if he has any doubt whatsoever that this man is Emory Rice, to let him go. Ingram doesn't do that. He sends him back to Maryland. And when he's returned to Cecil County, Mr. Knight says, that man is not my slave. So, this was the opening salvo for the Fugitive Slave Act in Philadelphia. And the papers never let Ingram forget it. So Gibson is actually a bit of a happy story, I suppose. He's actually returned to Philadelphia and he's set free. So I think this brings up, try to go back. Technical difficulties. Great, thank you. Phenomenal. So I think this raises a very interesting question, particularly for Henry Massey that day walking into the courtroom. Had anything changed? And did he have a reason to hope? And I think the answer is yes, there were reasons to hope. One of the first things I might reference is, why is he being tried in Philadelphia instead of Harrisburg? And the answer is, Harrisburg doesn't have a fugitive slave court anymore. In that city, the outrage machine, this upswell of public opinion, actually shamed the commissioner out of his job. He resigned, and they never found anybody willing to sit in the hot seat. So the court doesn't exist anymore. That's the reason why he's in Philadelphia to begin with. Unlike his earlier sort of eager self, Ingram actually delays the trial for a week. I think he senses that there might be some issues with Franklin Bright's claim, pardon me. I always make that mistake. He also actually requests, according to the newspaper, that Henry Massey give an affidavit, and this is really rather unusual. I'm not even 100% sure if it's technically legal under the wording of the Act, but I think he was just particularly concerned about the argument in question. And the crux of that argument is about this Bright family line of ownership. Because again, James Bright died, his estate was liquidated, and Henry Massey was supposed to go to Joseph. Joseph never took custody of him because Henry Massey ran away. And meanwhile, in 1853, Joseph and his wife and unborn child die of a fever. So the question becomes, does Franklin Bright have a right to Henry Massey? Now again, I without the court records, which don't exist anymore, unfortunately, it's hard to know what evidence exactly was presented. I suspect strongly that the wills of both James and Joseph were brought up to Philadelphia and presented as evidence. And if so, there is indeed a clause in Joseph's will that says basically, if I nor my wife nor child survive this illness, my belongings shall pass to my siblings. So, at the same time, I think the tide really begins to turn against Henry Massey in terms of this case with the arrival of Woolman Lynch, who comes up as sort of he's acting like sort of an adjutant to Franklin Bright, and the papers don't seem to catch on that Woolman is not just a friendly neighbor doing a good deed for a friend. He's Franklin's brother-in-law, so he has a bit of a vested interest in how the case turns out. In the end, that perhaps helps seal the deal. We do know that Henry Massey is tried and found to be a fugitive and returned to Kent Island. And it's interesting, again, the family plot thickens a little bit in that Sarah Lynch, a relative of Woolman, actually takes custody of him. And there's records of her basically checking him in and out of various overnight, almost, I hate to say it, almost Motel 6 slave jails, going back through Maryland, back to Kent Island. And so it's interesting, we don't know much about Sarah Lynch, at least not at the moment, but from looking at her census records, certainly to Henry Massey, he could be forgiven for suspecting that she was, in every sense, a slave catcher. She is a single head of household with quite a large number of slaves to her name. And I think it helps to explain why this woman is the one tasked with bringing this man forcibly back to Kent Island. So I think at this point in the story, it's become rather clear that the fugitive slave courts traded in identity more than the average court system did. And I think it raises an interesting question. Considering what happened to Adam Gibson, is Henry Massey when he's returned to Kent Island? I would argue, on the whole, the evidence probably would suggest yes, that the man who is returned and who shows up in the census records after the fact is most likely Henry Massey. I think it's perfectly reasonable to say that if he wasn't who the court said he was, he would have spoken up like Gibson, right? Even if you're not allowed to testify to the court directly, you can testify through your lawyers, right, your white proxies. I think that one weakness of that argument is that it assumes that this man had any hope whatsoever that his situation would turn out for the better. And considering the long losing track record of the people that legally defended fugitives in Philadelphia, I think a man could be forgiven for not having much hope at that moment. Assuming, and again, I think this is the likely story, but assuming that Henry Massey is indeed who we think he is, we don't know much about his second slavery when he's returned to Kent Island. We know more about his second freedom. He ends up marrying a woman named Maud, having a daughter, Mary, who was born in 1863. Before Maryland has formally abolished slavery. Interestingly, He appears in the census records as illiterate and sort of a field laborer in 1870, but 10 years later, he's a literate house servant in Gibson, Maryland. And this is where something rather interesting shows up, because when he's listed as part of that white household, the servants are him, his wife, and a young 18-year-old man named Elijah Slyman. And I mentioned these family groups that are present on the island. You can perceive through the wills. The Slymans were another family group that lived alongside the Masseys at Stoopley, Gibson. And it's remarkable that 15 years later, they were still maintaining these connections, or this kinship, to the point where I can't tell who told who, come up to Dixon, there are jobs to be had, but somehow somebody got one party or the other a job in that household, and they work together, and virtually the whole of both families relocates to that area. And so coming up very quickly to the modern day, I just want to mention, again, as I think was mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, Stoopley Gibson was just in September of 2021 announced to be a Network to Freedom site by the National Park Service. And again, all the thanks in the world to Andrew and everybody else who helped make that a possibility. The Network to Freedom, in case people are interested in getting involved in this, I hope you are. The Network to Freedom was founded by an act of Congress in 1988. And since that time, I think it's 600 plus, approaching 700 sites nationally that have been documented and formally admitted to the Network to Freedom. Oops. Well, don't worry about that. The main thing I wanted to just say in closing is that I strongly encourage anybody who might see this, if you're interested in this sort of history, if you'd like to know more about your neighbors and about your local roots, one of the best things you can do is to Google the Network to Freedom. Anybody can submit an application. So go ahead and do some digging and see what you can find in your own neck of the woods. I promise you won't regret it. So with that, I'll pass it back over to Andrew.
So, fascinating story, just an amazing kind of little picture of what life in the 19th century looked like here on the island and in the broader sort of mid-Atlantic region. And so I think it's really fascinating to hear Henry Massey's tale. And there are others as well. I mean, we actually, late into the process, actually found escaped fugitive ads, runaway slave ads, going back to the mid-1700s from Gibson. So there is a sort of a history here of what the enslaved population looked like, just on this one property. Not to mention all the other properties, estates, farms on the island. So there's a lot, tremendous amount of history, and people who remain to get studied more and understood better. I think as we sort of started this discussion, there was sort of this turnover period here after Franklin Wright, where the property was sold over to the white family, where it remained for sort of 3 to 4 generations, in kind of a tremendously sort of turbulent and creationary period, right? So, 1868, it was handed over or sold to Marmaduke, as I mentioned. That was a little hard to read here, so I apologize. It ultimately then passed to his son, Thomas White, or Thomas Herbie White, and then his son, Thomas Walter White. And so it remained in sort of the White family all the way through the early 20th century. Property went through quite a bit of expansion and renovation. We could do a whole other session on just the architecture of the house itself, but during this time period, they likely added a 3rd story to the building. They made changes to the brick and the fenestration, the layout. It was a changing society at that time, right? If you think about it, prior to the Civil War, it was largely a boat-based culture, right? So when you look at these different farms around Can Island, people were largely traveling between them by boat, right? Moving amongst the waterways. By the mid-1800s, you're seeing the emergence of the railroad, right? You're seeing horse and buggies start to come into play around Can Island. And so, the whole culture was sort of changing. You actually, I don't know if you can see in this picture here, you can actually see a boat from the late 1800s in this photo here. And so, yeah, a substantial amount of change. I kind of like some of this material, just an interesting sort of snapshot of what the culture was like. But they actually took out an ad for a teacher for the one-room schoolhouse here in Chester. It's a little bit right there. And again, kind of the common names that we mentioned earlier, right? You see, White, James Bright, and Goodman, right? So all three names that we presented earlier and show up on the maps and throughout much of the history, all being kind of involved as sort of custodians of this school system, this early educational. We talked a little bit about the house and sort of expansion, moving up to the third story. There was an additional wing that was built at that time as well. We do have some artwork and photographic documentation of the house at the time. This is a picture from sort of the late 19th century as well. So you can see the front porch, you can see the wing off the back, which is probably the kitchen, and some of this more service and support type infrastructure to run like a 200-acre plus farm. The house remained in the White family until right after the Great Depression. Ultimately, Mrs. White passed away, and it was spread amongst the children who had all kind of moved on to other careers. I think if you look at culturally, Ken Island at the time, it was also a lot of change. People were moving away from agriculture. You're starting to see more and more people go into trades and individual occupations, sort of in that 1920s period, going into the early 1930s. And so, as that was changing, people were truck runners, people were plumbers, people were taking on more trade-based careers, and so farming kind of fell out of favor. And you saw that story repeated all over the Eastern Shore during this period. So the property ended up being sold by the Whites to the McGuckin family. Ben McGuckin, D.F. McGuckin, was a financier out of New York. Another thing that was happening in this 1930s period was you sort of had this sort of colonialism and interest in sort of the founding of America becoming more and more popular. You had the Rockefellers investing in colonial Williamsburg and that opening in the early 1930s. It was just sort of fashionable to be kind of a colonial realist, right? And so it was very popular for people, wealthy people, to have sort of an authentic colonial country home. And so that's what McGuckin did. He purchased the farm and extensively restored the property in 1933, 1934. There's a lot of history. We get into a period now where there's more newspaper records and articles, so you start to be able to build more of a chronology of what was happening. Between that period, between 1934, they owned the property until 1950. And in the latter half of the 20th century, there was a succession of multiple owners. Essentially, if you think about 1950, you've got the Bay Bridge starting to come into the picture. People are recognizing that Ken Island is going to be able to handle a larger population than 150 people that were here in 20 years. And so there was a lot of development, subdivision, people wanting to be on the water. And so what you had was a series of sort of development-minded people who owned the property. Some worked on things like the bridge, or developing some of the other communities in the 60s and 70s and 80s here on Ken Island. Ultimately, in 2001, I believe, it was sold to Elmstone Development, to a developer based here in Maryland. They completed the Gibson's Grant subdivision, which was built. The original property, the original house on about an acre and a half has been sort of carved out and preserved, which is now part of the recognition from the National Park Service. I think we mentioned before, as well my wife, myself, and our son and my dog live today. So always a fun project. Lots of interesting discoveries we've made, lots of ghosts that we've experienced. Happy to tell you all about that some other time. And so with that, we'll sort of wrap it up. Welcome to Q&A maybe at the end. But just wanted to point out, if people are interested in a couple assets and things that are available, if people would like to learn more, we do have a Wikipedia page with kind of a consolidation of this and more of the history, including a lot of the primary sources material. The other thing I would recommend checking out, if you're interested in kind of the history of Maryland, is the Maryland Historic Trust maintains a system called Medusa, which is what all the researchers use across the state. And one of the things that they make publicly available are these determinations of eligibility. So there are analyses that are done by sort of architects and historians on properties, and there's probably a dozen or 2 dozen of them on Kent Island alone that you can go in, pull up the determination of eligibility. Oftentimes they're 20-page tomes or longer with the full history of the property, the people, the census records, and a lot of good primary source information. I'll also do a plug here for the Kent Island Heritage Society. We do have space at the local library here in Kent Island. If you've never been, it's fascinating. There's actually I've been since the foundation, but there were cabinets and cabinets of original content, original material to review histories of families, lots of photocopies of Bible records of different families and their descendants. So worth checking out as well. I mentioned Medusa as well, and then if folks are interested, I know we can get this to the Kent Island Heritage Society as well, but of history and houses is a story of a number of properties here on Kent Island, sort of history of those homes, including White's Heritage or Stoopley Gibson. That's in here also. So highly recommend checking that out. If you haven't seen it before, there's copies in the library where you can purchase your own. I think that's all I've got. Any questions?
I very much appreciate the effort that you've made and that Matt has made. And I think what's interesting, you mentioned the number of names associated with that. In addition to maybe some questions you may have in your mind, we've got some people here who've got some own personal experiences with that property, including a lady who milked her first cow in the barn there. So if anybody has, we can also educate the educators. If you have some personal memories or anything like that, feel free to bring those up. And then if anybody has questions, please bring them up.
Sure.
So, Andrew, you live in places around China. I had no idea there was an archaeological study done. Where in the neighborhood is that original foundation?
So the original foundation is in the King Court, so it's sort of around the corner from there.
So, is it on the property or in the cul-de-sac?
It's sort of near where the cul-de-sac is, but yeah. It's interesting, we talked about this a little bit, but with archaeologists, there's a bit of a sensitivity about disclosing exact locations because there are treasure hunters who try to go out and find their own treasures. So actually, I don't truly know exactly where it is, but it's somewhere in that general cul-de-sac area there. Yeah.
I'd like to call the next guest, or the next speaker, or the next questioner, is a man named Doug Bishop. Doug Bishop writes for the Bay Times. He is an amazing community resource. He shows up at these things. This is old-style journalism. So with that embarrassing introduction, Doug.
You said that exactly the way I asked. I have 2 questions. Is there going to be a marker placed that gives a grant recognizing this as an underground railroad site?
The intention is that there will be. It hasn't been planned out, but just because the recognition just happened this last year, and with COVID and everything else, it's been a little delayed. But the intention is there will be some sort of identifier, certainly on the websites and in all the documentation. But yeah, we're looking to try to get some sort of marker or identifier put there.
Okay, I hope that will be announced
Yeah, certainly.
for the community when that happens. My second question, for those people who think they know what critical race theory is, which essentially for many people is teaching anything about slavery is wrong. It's a really confusing topic for many people, but how do you think people who are opponents of critical race theory would receive your presentation?
I think that's a great question. I mean, my response would be that they were, the enslaved population were residents of the island just as much as everybody else.
I can't hear your answer.
All right, I will be louder.
Yes, please do.
My point was that I think the people who were enslaved here in
Hey, Andrew,
Can
can you
Island,
step down so we can get rid
I
of
can.
the
I will
Right.
stand out here in the front.
Okay, yes.
Hey.
Come on down.
Yes.
Stand over here. My point was I think the people who were enslaved on Can Island, many if not all working on the farms and in the homes, were Can Islanders just as much as everybody else who lived here. And so while their story may not be as easy to uncover because their names aren't called out in the census documents, there aren't primary source materials that make it really hard for researchers like Matt to really document that historical record. They were residents of Can Island just as much as we are. And so, I think it's important for anybody, critical race theory or not, to recognize that these were living, breathing human beings. And so whether you want to get into the politics of slavery and the practice of slavery and what it may or may not have done to society as a whole even through today, I could leave that for people who are far more knowledgeable in the States. And my opinion as a homeowner is that the story of Henry Massey is just as important as any of the other individuals who lived in the home. And so the more we can learn about these people, the better.
Amen.
The only thing I would add to what Andrew has said, I just would add a personal story, which is I collect, as time goes by, stories of interesting ways of how people think about or interact with history. And one of my recent acquisitions was a colleague who was lamenting and was upset at the fact that so much of African American history seemed to be so very sad. To which I sort of replied, I don't know why exactly you thought it would be happening, and that's okay, right? It's the history of the history. There's nothing to be afraid of. It is there to be reckoned with, but I think that the healthier thing to do, rather than turning away from it, is to turn it into the wind and to engage with it and trying to take that as a reason to try and improve things going forward with the stuff that is still unwritten. There's no way, as much as I would love to, as much as I try to go back and to resurrect Henry Massey, I'm not God. It's not quite possible. And so I think the better thing is to sort of turn our focus to the future and try to make good on those promises. So.
More questions? The question that I had is somebody who's only lived there for 13 years, and Linda and Lou and some others here maybe. What was that, when it was a farm, what was it, Linda, what were they doing? What were they growing? What was it like?
Corn.
Corn and beans. Corn and beans.
I don't think it was tobacco. I don't know.
So
I think we're about like that.
Probably early on. Yeah, a lot of it.
yeah,
It was corn and a dairy farm.
As the former, I was the director of the oldest Christian community on the island, Christchurch Parish. My predecessors were paid with tobacco, as were all the clergy on the eastern shore. Unfortunately, tobacco has a terrible derogatory effect on the land, and probably within 50, and my historian friends are going to
That was actually good stuff.
the soil was so depleted and no longer grew tobacco, and they turned to, and did become, I believe, a feeding station for Annapolis and the Western Shore. Like a lot of food left here and moved across the bay, but my predecessors initially were paid in pounds of tobacco.
yeah. And there's a fair amount of history to that as well. Actually, the depletion happened pretty early on. So you're talking, into the early 1700s when they switched over to primarily, the Holy Trinity that we see today, right? It was corn, it was wheat, and it was soy. And so you had a lot of that type of farming that was going on. I mentioned the comment of the breadbasket of the revolution. Again, I'll let the wine road folks tell that story, but it really did provide a lot of that grain. Stoopley Gibson in particular continued that sustenance farming until it was purchased by the McGuckins. They, from my understanding, tended to use it more for cattle. So Mr. McGuckin was a big cow breeders, and there's all sorts of records of different 4-H competitions and articles about his dairy that he was running and the quality of the milk that came out of the property. So it was probably, until it was turned into more of a plant development in 1950, probably in that early 20th century, it was primarily cattle.
And just to add to that, I think also the question, or the answer rather than the question about tobacco, was partially answered just by geography. Along with being incredibly bad for the land itself, tobacco is also incredibly land intensive. In order to get a profit out of it, you need an immense amount of land. And as you all, as residents of an island, know, land is at a premium on Cat Island. So.
And tobacco tends to grow better in warmer climates. It did grow here, and it was planted as a crop, and it was used to pay for the clergy. And there's a lot of historical records of that. But at least anecdotally, what I've heard is it never grew as well here as it did in even Virginia, but more so North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. And so as you had the western expansion across the South, I think it was easier and better to have sort of more sustenance crops. And I think there's records of, carrots and other, vegetables and fruit orchards, apples, pears. I mean, you have a pretty good array of sort of different food products that came out of the Eastern Shore that led to Annapolis, Baltimore, to sort of the Western Shore.
Might say farms back over self-sustaining, so they had small range of wheats, barley, rye, they had some dairy cattle, they had some gardens. They've been on the shore at one time, peaches. They're peach plantations.
Yes.
White pepper, peaches.
Right.
You're right, the tobacco killed the grass. That's why, thank God the economists came along and saw the old that, so we started fertilizing. And we started getting into corn and soybean. I'm just curious, Orlando Ride is White Terriers part of the QA 500?
The QA 500.
Okay.
So Orlando Ride did write the determination of eligibility. So he's done studies on the
Well,
problem.
two Maryland Historical Trust, there's people worldwide designed this, surveys were done on 500 homes, sites in Queen Anne's County. I would be willing to bet White Terriers could thank enforcing Orlando is deceased, but I would tend to think that White Terriers is on the Maryland Historical Trust QA 500. It's coming for all counties.
It certainly is in the Maryland Historic Trust, and I think it was 1974 you put it out, so if that's the right timing.
So you've read that?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. We spent some time with it.
It's there.
It was actually updated in 2006. I
Well, he may come soon on the construction of the building.
He did. Oh, yeah, I could do a whole lecture on just his study of the architecture. Absolutely. And it's fascinating.
So you're gonna do carbonated water?
No carbon. No carbon.
Well, we said it, Dave Boxo, the presentations they've done will eventually be on the Canada Heritage Society website. And with that, I'll turn over to Jack.
Just done it with your applause, but I wanted to echo the tremendous thank you to both Andrew and Matt. And John particularly for helping to bring this together. We hope that the Kent Island Heritage Society to become more diverse in our effort to share the real history of Kent Island. And we really welcome the story that has come out of Stoopley, Gibson, White Heritage, and Matt's research and the recognition of the National Park Service for what's happened here. We hope to be able to do more of that kind of recognition in the future. And we appreciate the support of all of you for coming here this evening and helping to support that effort. Again, thank you all very, very much.